Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this new session of the Financial Statement Series at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Nicolas Véron. It's my pleasure to introduce Pierre Wunsch and Irene Monasterolo. We'll discuss climate finance and a kind of big picture view of how it fits between the fight against climate change and financial services policy. Pierre Wunsch got his PhD in economics at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium and also a master's degree in public and international affairs at Princeton University in the US. He started his career as a researcher at the French Statistical Office in C and at École Normale Supérieure, the high-level research organization in Paris. He then worked for the Belgian Federal Planning Bureau in Brussels. And from 1996 to 2000, he was chief of staff and advisor in the Brussels government, the government of the region of Brussels. And in 2001, advising Alain Zener at the federal government in Brussels as well. Pierre then spent a number of years in the private sector. He was a senior executive at the main electricity company in Belgium, Tractebel and Electrabel. That's how we met. And in 2011, he became the head of staff of Finance Minister Didier Reynders, a position he held for 3 years. In 2011, Pierre joined the National Bank of Belgium as member of the governing board, director, then in 2015 as deputy governor, and in 2019 as governor, a position for which he was renewed for another 5-year term earlier this year. Congratulations, Pierre. Pierre has also been a university lecturer at Université Catholique de Louvain for a decade between 1997 and 2017. He's as this summary illustrates, he's got a unique mix of academic, policy, political, and business experience. And among his many contributions, I must mention a chapter in the volume The Green Frontier, which was published recently by the Peterson Institute, co-edited by Jean Pisani-Ferry and Adam Posen on the green transition. Irene Monasterolo studied at University of Pavia in Italy and at University of Bologna, where she got her PhD in agri-food economics and statistics in 2012. She then went on postdoctoral positions, first at the Global Sustainability Institute in Cambridge as a research fellow, and then in Boston University in climate economics and finance. She has also worked at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, where she's still affiliated, as with Boston University. She has been a visiting researcher at the Serbian Faculty of Agriculture in Belgrade and a number of other organizations, including Stanford University, the Sant'Anna School in Pisa, and many academic contributions, which I will not list all of them, but in 2021, she became a professor of climate finance at EDEC University in Nice in France, and in last year, in October 23, professor of climate finance at the Utrecht University School of Economics in the Netherlands. Irene has also done a lot of consulting for policy organizations. She's actually the co-founder and senior partner at a firm called Climate Finance Alpha, which she co-founded in 2019, which does climate stress tests, service provision, and related offerings, and has consulted for the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and I forget many others. With that, Pierre, over to you.
Thank you, Nicolas. I have to share my presentation, so that's the moment of stress, because I'm not used to Zoom anymore, but hopefully it works. It looks like
Seems to work.
It seems to work. I'll try to put it in slideshow mode. Okay, so first, thanks a lot for having me. And I'm not a specialist of climate finance, so my perspective would be, say, holistic. That's the polite word. The first point I guess I would want to make is that the climate transition is the first policy-induced industrial revolution. So not only does it come with a lot of technological uncertainty about the real impact of the climate transition, but also a lot of regulatory uncertainty. And that will have an impact on some issues I will discuss later on, but for instance, how we deal with risks. It has, of course, the climate transition has broad implication for the financial system. I'm not going to list them all, but it makes it quite difficult to discuss that in 10 minutes introduction. But say, you have the very naive view, which is if only bankers would finance the transition, then, job done, to more sophisticated issues. I guess we agree broadly on the basics. Where we might disagree in some instances is how unique and special is the climate transition, especially as a risk compared to other risks, being geopolitical risks, cyber, and so on. And there, I guess, a number of people differ. Just to set the scene and to be clear on it, and I'm not going to be long on that, but where am I in terms of the cost of the transition? I see it as a negative supply shock. So I believe there is a cost. I don't think it's going to be a walk in the park, but I think it's doable from a macro perspective. My best estimate of the cost for a country like Belgium is 10 basis points of growth, so reduction in the growth potential for 25 years. And, if you can save the planet at that price, I would not hesitate. So for me, it's a no-brainer, which doesn't mean that it's easy from a political perspective. Impact on R-star and inflation, we may come back to it, but I would say uncertain. As was mentioned, I guess, in the written introduction to the webinar, the European Commission, but also to some extent the regulator in Europe and the central bank have taken a lot of initiatives in terms of dealing with climate issues and climate risks. I'm not going to go through them, but let's say it's more than marginal. It's really a lot, and it's quite ambitious, and it tends to be mixed to some extent with ESG consideration. So the first point, and I'll start with general consideration that I would want to make, is that in terms of the agenda, it is ambitious, but it's somewhat ambiguous. So to list a number of ways to interpret what the agenda is it mainly about transparent information? You want shareholders and customers of banks to be informed about whether an investment or product is green or not, which I think is, more than normal. Is it about financing the transition? Is it mainly about credit risk or stranded assets? Or is it that we want to use the financial system as an instrument to accelerate the transition and actually make the financial system greener than the underlying economy? Again, a number of those issues are quite consensual. I would certainly agree that customers and shareholders have to be informed. But of course, now with Draghi report, we can say that there might be an issue of proportionality, and that regulatory burden in Europe tends to be heavy, and certainly on the banking front. And if the objective is to make green finance cheaper, I guess so far it's fair to say that the impact is very limited, a number of basis points, which is marginal compared to the movements we've seen in interest rates. And then there are a number of, I guess, more complicated sensitive issues. Why do we need the green taxonomy, stop financing oil? I'll come back to that. Gaming, I think, is an important issue. Just to give one example, leasing, having some capital moving to leasing will save you a lot in terms of scope 1 and 2. There is ESG backlash in the US and elsewhere that we need to take into account. And then it was mentioned by Patrick Bolton at the annual meeting of Bruegel, just the proliferation of green financial instruments, scoring and the likes is making it very difficult to actually create transparency. Just 1 minute of a more philosophical consideration. I have the impression we are ever more creating a gray zone between what is legal, but then legal, but not okay. And I have many examples I can give, but just stick to one. I was discussing with one CEO, and they had committed to following some ESG scoring. And then after a while, a number of years, he's being told by these people specialized in the matter, we have to stop financing shooting clubs, because otherwise we're going to lose our scoring. And he's like, okay. And then he looks, he's got maybe 10 in portfolios. In a way, from a business perspective, is a no-brainer. You stop financing shooting clubs. Otherwise, you lose your scoring. Now, I think we have to think about what would be the reaction of people that are in a shooting club, that have to follow a number of national regulations, pay back their debt, and they are being told by their bankers, actually, it's not okay to be in a shooting club. Now, in a society which is becoming ever more polarized, I think this is poison, and I think we should avoid that. So I have other examples, but I wanted to mention that one. Then there is the question why we need the taxonomy and climate plans and what we expect from that as an instrument, beyond maybe transparency. When, say, Europe has committed to go to net zero and basically to take regulation and pricing measures to go to net zero. One could say it's because of third country considerations, so imported emissions, that may be one consideration. My concern is a bit that when you go for climate plans, when you go for taxonomy, you tend to go for linear efforts, which are not efficient, and sometimes promoting technologies that are not efficient. We've had a green hydrogen bubble in Europe. Two years ago, it was going to save us and be a big part of the transition. You see ever more that green hydrogen is going to arrive late in the transition and be very expensive. If you put it in your plan, what is it worth? And actually, what we've seen is that a lot of these plans have been revised again and again and downwards. Stop funding fossil fuels. I believe supply destruction before demand destruction is bad policy. It's just going to give money to Russia, Venezuela, and Iran instead of taxing oil and bringing revenues to states. So I think we need to focus on demand destruction before we focus on supply destruction. It can have a very negative impact. Financing the transition very shortly, but I hear a lot of people saying we need to find, and finding, I mean, for foreign economies is a bit weird, but we need to find hundreds of billions to finance the transition. I don't really believe it's an issue. We are in a world of excess savings. Interest rates have been low for the last decade. I think banks, honestly, in Europe can finance EVs, heat pumps. I think industry has access to finance. And it's not so much about risk capital. So to me, the issue is not so much finding money, but deciding who's going to pay for the transition. And that is an issue that we like to dodge. And then suddenly farmers arrive in Brussels and, it all unravels. On credit risk, of course, we need to look at the impacts of the transition on credit risk. Conceptually, it's a no-brainer. I'm a bit concerned that the concept of credit risk is becoming blurred, that we mix it with policy consideration. And you hear a lot of people basically saying bankers don't get it. The risks are huge and bankers don't want to see it and the markets don't want to see it. And I think it's in a way collapsing a reality. If we don't do anything, years from now is going to be a big problem, to a reality which is completely different, that most banks have a duration for a big share of their portfolios, which is 1 to 3 years, and actually don't see a lot of risk in the short term. And then there is the issue how you deal with regulatory risk. So we have this stress test at the ECB where you basically say the governments are going to impose an oil price with the ETS of $450 per barrel and then watch and do nothing. I think this is very, very unlikely. But then we do produce those stress tests and say, oh, the risks are huge. I think it's actually not very credible what we come with in this regard. Green bubbles we can discuss, but basically I think, and a lot of people try to do that, but I think we are not going to be able to reduce the transition risks in terms of credit risk to a metrics of carbon intensity. A lot of green investments are risky and it's much more complicated than that. And likewise, I don't believe that in this kind of nitrogen uncertainty story that the risks are so difficult to even conceive of that we need to put buffers as a precautionary buffers in all direction. To a large extent, the transition risk is comparable to oil shock, and we have past experiences with respect to that. But my concern is really, again, that credit risk analysis has been for a long time something which is, very formalized. You need a lot of data, you have backtesting, and I would not like to replace that with kind of some gut feeling that actually the risks are much higher than we can measure. So the role of transfer banks, I will be very short on it, but I have to come clear. I'm more on the US side than the European side. I think there is a risk of a sort of animal farms reading of the treaty, and especially of Article 3. I can come back to that. But more specifically, I think supporting is not well defined. So when we say we have to support the EU policies, I see the transition as a problem of a trade-off. And when politicians have decided on a trade-off and what the equilibrium is of, we may disagree, but I cannot support the trade-off or the result of the trade-off. I would change where we are in this trade-off, and that is, to me, policy making, which is forbidden by the treaty. And then the other concern I have is that we say, as long as it is without prejudice to our primary mandate, it's okay. But it's actually not a binding constraint. I can have a 100 basis point subsidy for green investments and still meet my 2% objective. I just have to increase the interest rates on non-green investments. So I think what we present as a constraint is actually not a binding constraint. So I will stop there. So essentially my message is, we should clarify the ambition and which instruments are used for which objective, and then measure whether we go there. There is a risk of institutional mission creep, especially in Europe. There is a risk of importing politically sensitive issues within the financial system, and I think it's going to create damages, and it does already in the US. And then I'm afraid that the notion of risk, and especially credit risk, is becoming very blurred and uncertain in some of these discussions are here, even with people, say, within the SSM and ECB environment. And we'll stop there.
Fantastic. This was incredibly packed with lots of points, provocative points as well. Thank you so much. And over to you, Irene.
Yeah, so I will address mostly points in which regard. I will start right from your last points about credit risk, climate stress test, and then go to green bubble and taxonomies. So since it's about regulation, and I've been working on a climate stress test, I mean, we developed the first climate stress test over 10 years ago in research. So, and we work with several financial institutions in Europe and abroad, so in Asia and Caribbean. I have something to say about first that we do need financial regulation for climate risk, in particular for climate risk assessment and risk management. However, we don't need more, we need better regulation. And this is always the same story also for climate. And then we will see how. So first, we need regulation because climate risk is material. It's material already now for, if you look, for instance, even just at a acute physical risk like floods. I mean, we had even recent examples in several parts of Europe, so from Austria to Italy and below in the last weeks. These affects already now sovereign fiscal budgets and potentially financial stability concerns, because it depends always, as you mentioned, about who will pay, either taxpayers of today or taxpayers of tomorrow if we create new debt. So that's the point. Risks are even material and could become even material in the short term. So we don't need to wait for the introduction of a $450 US carbon tax when we talk about transition risk, because as we know, financial markets works about expectations. So expectations matter a lot in finance. And if expectations about the transition risk change, for instance, when we have, if we have another energy price shock due to continuous dependence on fossil fuels of other countries, because this is where fossil fuel come from. I mean, that's we can process in Europe, but the material comes from somewhere else. Then expectations of investors about credit risk of firms, which either produce or are reliant on high carbon goods, then will change abruptly, and we will have transition risk even tomorrow. And this could lead to large asset price volatility, which matters then for the financial price and financial stability mandate of central banks. So the first point is climate risk and material. The second is that we live in a world of market failures. So what we learned from the last financial crisis is that markets are right until they are very wrong. And this brings a lot of implications. So and here it's where the first point where regulation should come in. So doing climate stress tests using only past prices or news based on past data, I mean, this is clearly doesn't allow you to capture ongoing and future risk, and you could be largely wrong. So we cannot really get into there. The third point is a policy failure, because in order to make the transition and to avoid large trade-offs and to improve our credit risk, we need credible and coherent and long-term policy programming. We need incentives. So we are economists, we believe in incentives. These incentives are not there yet because look at the response to the energy price crisis, which just increases the reliance on and dependency on other providers of fossil fuels. And this in turn doesn't allow investors, but also supervisors to currently price credit risk linked to exposure to sources of climate risk. And banks are not are piling up risk because they are keeping on increasing their exposure to high carbon and fossil fuel assets, also as a result of the policy developments. So risk is there and it's even increasing. We need a taxonomy because it's the only science-based way that we have to allow investors to identify what is green from what is not green, and thus to adjust firms' credit risk and financial risk. And however, we need taxonomies which are science-based and not greenwashed by politics. So that's always the point. Also, green is now much more efficient. When we talk about conventional greens, so when we talk about renewables, are much less costlier than other alternatives. So there was also a speech by Isabel Schnabel a few days ago. And also markets are rewarding already now with long-term performance measure of greenness, which are less subjective than the measures that are used now by financial regulators in order to identify what is green. So there are all the issues with emissions and so on. Measure based on energy technologies are already rewarded by the market, so regulation should consider it.
Nicolas, you want me to react, or you're on mute, Nicolas?
Go ahead.
No, I mean, conceptually, I guess we agree. It's a question again of quality of the regulation and degree and proportionality. One question I think we need to raise is whether physical risks are not more a question for insurers than they are for banks. Of course, there is a question about the coverage, the gap that we have in some countries. But in a country like Belgium, where we have a very good coverage from insurance, I think it's much more an issue, physical risk, for insurers than they are for banks. But okay, that's a technical discussion we can have. I think the fact that central bankers would look at credit risk and financial stability issues is a no-brainer. We need to do it. What I'm concerned about is that we have kind of decided that the risks were higher than accepted by the markets. And then we torture people a bit. And as long as they don't give the answer that the risks are huge, we keep asking. And honestly, I have some friends that are in the banking sector and that are very climate friendly and that care a lot about climate, and they are desperate. They're really desperate. And they are telling me, we are being pushed to do greenwashing because we're being under pressure to green our portfolios, and there are many ways to game that. So I think it's more a question of how you do it than whether you should do it, because I agree we should do it. But for instance, you make these stress tests with a static balance sheet for 25 years. I mean, in the US, when you see the rotation of firms, any stress test with a 25-year static balance sheet would bankrupt the banks. So, and actually, my concern is that we need that to show that the risks are big. And Irene, I agree with you that if we only look at the past is no measure of the size of the risk. But we cannot replace the past is no good indication by we are going to build scenarios where it's terrible and then ask banks to react to that. Because then it becomes so uncertain which story you can come with in a stress test that they cannot just manage the risks. So we need still some discipline. And honestly, when I talk to bankers in Belgium, they cannot name one company that has gone bankrupt in their portfolio because of climate issues. Actually, those that have gone bankrupt invested in green stuff, and it went wrong. Policy failure. I agree with you. We don't have today credible incentives, and there is a very difficult situation there because the market and banks need credible price signals or regulatory signals. The problem is sometimes we have put in place some of those signals that don't survive contact with the enemy, being reality and political reality. And then suddenly, it's, what happened with farmers. Suddenly you have farmers in the street, and then suddenly what you had decided 3 months ago is not valid again, which I think pleads for really looking at the cost of different technologies and making sure that you don't impose things that will be politically then impossible to sell to your population. And there I don't agree with you. I don't think the taxonomy is the only way to go for net zero. And actually, I think the taxonomy pushes for some technologies that are way too expensive, that are not efficient, and that are creating problems. And actually, I don't believe people do look so much at the taxonomy. I do agree with you that conventional greens are cheaper. So there are a number of technologies that are already close to being competitive. Renewables, hopefully within 10 to 15 years, EVs, heat pumps in some environments. But some of these green technologies are still very expensive. And then one concern I have is that when we ask people to come with climate plans, when you're in an industry where the technology is still very expensive and not mature, what do you put in your plan? I can put in my plan that I will buy green hydrogen very cheap 10 years from now, but I don't control the technology. And there is just no way I can commit to that plan. So I'm a bit concerned how people will look at the plans. I mean, 2 years ago, everybody was saying green hydrogen is going to be very cheap. I mean, 60 euro per megawatt hour. I could have put in my plan, I will use a lot of green hydrogen. But then 2 years later, everybody says, no, green hydrogen is going to come late in the transition, it's going to be very expensive. So I think we really need to ask ourselves, how can you commit to a plan as a company or as a bank when you have such technological and regulatory uncertainty? And I think it's a difficult issue. And that markets are rewarding greener companies, yes, probably, I think at the margin. But there was this period not so long ago, before the Ukraine crisis, where we saw green finance as, a win-win proposition. It was, if you invest in green, your returns will be higher and the risks are lower. Yeah, that's easy. I mean, the thing is, it didn't last, and people made a lot of money on the brown stuff and on, especially on oil and gas during the Ukrainian crisis. And I think we have to accept that, except for the easy part with a no-brainer, which are renewables and so on, if the green transition is going to cost something, you cannot sell green finance as more return and less risk. This is not going to fly. And my impression, especially in the US, is that then a lot of people choose returns, and that trying to basically starve companies from financing is just not going to work, because you will have enough people, private equity and others, that will keep financing. I've talked to a CEO who told me, Guy, it's simple. I don't finance oil anymore. Oil is very profitable, and they can then finance that if need be in the US, so I'm not going to do it again. I can show that I'm green. And I'm going to finance the green part of the oil major activities. But it's not going to change anything.
So this is perhaps more of two sides of the debate than is usual in this series. I don't want it to be too pugilistic. I know you want to talk Irene, but let me just convey the questions we're already having from the floor, and we have many people who are very knowledgeable in the audience. So Stephen Cecchetti is asking precisely about this idea of, the risk of the taxonomy dividing the corporate landscape into kind of two camps, not black and white, but green and brown, and private investors who don't care about carbon emissions investing in the latter. How is it possible to avoid that trap, Irene? And how do you think of the taxonomy as something that would avoid the kind of pitfalls that Pierre just referred to? And please don't try to refute all the things that Pierre said, because that's not what we want to have as a discussion here. Let's focus on the taxonomy for a moment.
No, that's absolutely the point. I mean, there are some points that are actually well taken. So how the taxonomy was born? I mean, it was born to help investors to identify what is a green activity in the economy, so not green assets, and what is not, or what is a sustainable activity in the and what is not, right? To avoid the issues with greenwashing that we are seeing when we use now as a proxy of greenness metrics like emission intensity or emissions without considering scope 3 or without looking at the quality of disclosure or ESG scores. So now, so the idea was really to try to identify with science-based criteria what could be defined as a sustainable activity, and based also on technologies that are not only the very expensive ones or high-fly ones like hydrogen that were discussed by Pierre, on which I agree. We see all what happened, but also more standard renewable technologies like solar panel and wind, which are the ones that actually are performing well. So this is the idea. Unfortunately, what happened is that from the original version to then what happened, what we have now, there was a process of, let's say, there was a political process that allowed to include in the taxonomy technologies that are not properly aligned with the original plan. And this, of course, creates confusion in the market. So the idea is to have an identification of what is sustainable and what is not. And with sustainable, you have sustainable already now and eligible to become sustainable, like cement, would it reach a certain level of green performance. And this would help actually to price the difference of firms' revenues coming from certain type of technologies and other type of technologies, so low carbon, high carbon, and better adjust its future performance, so economic and financial performance, conditioned also to the scenarios, which is what, for instance, the NGFS is developing.
NGFS is a network for the greening of the financial sector and
green
that involves central banks, right?
Yeah, a network for green financial system, yeah.
So maybe on that one.
Yeah, I'd like to, in a way, because you've encouraged us to look holistically at these issues and to think radically if needed. I'd like to push you a bit on the taxonomy. Is it, at the end of the day, unhelpful? Should we get rid of the taxonomy, or can it be salvaged somehow? That's to you, Pierre.
That's to me, sorry, so it was for Irene. Look, I mean, by training, I'm a public economist. I believe when you have a public good issue and externalities, you need to regulate. I don't think because of free riders, I don't think you can just move things around by just publishing standards if they don't come with strict regulation. I think standards are useful for those that want to move faster than a regulation. And that's where I believe creating some degree of transparency is important. But in a way, the issue is simple. We need to go to net zero. Any emission at some point will be, too much. And the problem is the time dimension, is that some part of transition are quite easy. Some others, we still don't know which technologies are going to be both, technologically feasible, but also economically feasible. And I'm afraid the taxonomy will be always one step behind technological progress. So I believe we need to work with instruments that are not 200, actually it's only 1,000 page long and it's going to move to 2,000 pages long. I mean, I don't think this can work. I mean, I think the objective is to go to net zero. I believe, if we can do it politically, we need to rely on regulation to do it in Europe. And then, I'm in compliance with the regulation or I'm not. And, as easy as that. One issue is, of course, extraterritoriality. How do you deal with imported emissions? And there it's complicated. And you have taxonomy and you have scope 3. Just to raise one issue, India is committed to net zero in 2070. Europe wants to remain an open economy and we want to trade with India. How are you going to trade with India and report on scope 3 and net zero scope 3 if you trade with Indian companies? I think it's going
sorry
to
to
be very
interrupt.
difficult.
Just for our audience who don't necessarily know what Scope 3 is, can you summarize it in 2 sentences?
So Scope 3 is really emission, including those that are incorporated in your inputs. So not only your own emissions or the energy use, but say you use steel from India in your production, you have to look at the carbon content of India. We have the same issue with deforestation, and then you have some countries that say, "I don't want you to report on who's the even owner of the ground on which some nuts are being produced, cocoa nuts or cacao nuts or whatever." So we are there trying to impose some extraterritoriality to some other countries that will not go to net zero as fast as Europe. And again, I don't think it has been really discussed. How do we deal with that? So some companies have to report Scope 3 emissions. You know, if it's not net zero because they import some material which is legal from India, how do you deal with that? So I think there will be indeed a number of companies that will where it's going to be part of their business model to be green. What I hear, though, from the industries in Belgium is that those are niche products that most of the time, when technology is more expensive, green technology is more expensive, they cannot justify the added price. So that it's only for niche customers that you can justify it. But you know, in most cases, it's not a good economic proposition. So you need actually more regulation.
We have a question from Pierre Raffi who refers to recently published research that finds that banks are not able to generate yield advantages by issuing green bonds in comparison to other corporate entities. Do you have an explanation for that, or any of you want to react?
I think there are not enough people that are willing to pay in terms of getting less return. I think the only sector where I've seen numbers that are a little bit significant would be in the tobacco industry. Apparently, their financing cost is a bit higher. But I mean, we know a lot of companies they've sold their most dirty stuff to private equity, and it's quite easy. You know, you start with a target, you identify what is really dirty in your portfolio of assets, and you sell the most dirty part to private equity. It's outside the regulated financial system, and then you can show that your numbers are nicer. But it doesn't change anything. The assets that have been sold still pollute, and maybe even more because nobody looks at it anymore.
Irene, what do you make of that argument?
Yes, I agree that it's just passing the hot potato in this regard. So it's not that the risk disappears, it's just it has been passed to someone else, most in the unregulated market. So also depends also, there are on the one hand consumer demands, pressures. So there is literature in sustainable finance showing that customers who want to go green actually are willing to give up some return in the short term, and this could be also a reason. Another point is what is green in the green bond. So in this comes back to the discussion we had before about the standards and so on, and greenwashing. And the third point is, however, that there is always so far mostly research and practices focused on the very short term, but we know sustainability is a mid to long term dimension. So when we look instead at the longer term, so over 5 years, we see that instead there are different results. So it's an issue of what is green, then preferences, and also the time horizon.
To be clear, I'm not against green finance. I think we live in the market economy. If some people want not to invest in brown and to invest in green, there should be room and space for these people to have access to assets and financial assets that they want to buy. My question is more whether we want to regulate that and maybe over-regulate it. Whether we say, if we want to go to net zero, it's about regulation, it's about carbon pricing, and we will facilitate the development of some green labels. But and that's it, or whether we really want, and that's we're the way we're going in Europe, where it's end. And I don't think we can, go to net zero only with carbon pricing, because the marginal technology is way too expensive. It's probably direct air capture. You need a carbon price of 500 euro per ton. That's not politically feasible. So I completely get that you have to combine carbon pricing with some regulation. But here it's also, a carbon price will allow you to focus on the most efficient ways to go to net zero. And when you discuss with people that are non-economists, they tend to believe that it's a linear trajectory that you have to go to, and that all firms have to follow the same trajectory. So they will expect from the climate plans that, you all reduce at a speed which is in line with the macro picture. But that's precisely what you want to avoid with a carbon price. So I can already see people from, NGOs and telling some firms, oh, you're not doing enough because you have not reduced your emission by 50% in 2030. Well, you don't want all firms to reduce emission in a proportional way. Some firms will come later in the transition because the technology is not mature, and some others should already be close to zero because we have technology. So to me, there is also a question of, a sort of, we want it all. We want a sort of market mechanism, but at the same time, we have more like planification. It's about climate plans, and we want to combine the two. And I think at some point you need to choose which logic you follow. Either you go for planification or you go for more, market mechanism. And I agree with some form of binding regulation.
The Draghi report, it's the talk of the town in Brussels this month, inevitably, but also has framed the discussion very much in terms of, compliance burden in Europe, not only with climate policies, but with other aspects of regulation. Irene, you're an insider in all of these policy debates. Do you think that the change of the Commission, the fact that we have a new Commission, the Draghi report, with outcomes of the European Parliament election, which have shifted in a more kind of conservative direction, is that signaling a shift in policy, or do you think how do you think of the policy trajectory going forward?
We were talking before about policy failures. Yes, so that's indeed for sure. You can feel a change in direction. Right in a time where probably we would not need it in order to anchor expectations. And what I fear will hurt the most will be, on the one hand, the real economy, and on the other hand, also central banks, because once we are in a disorderly transition and in 10 years we end up really having to do the transition, the cost will be much higher. Governments will be completely unprepared because of the lack of programming, plus which should go hand in hand with other type of policies. So we need both fiscal and financial coordination. So everybody should play a role in this. And in the end, central banks will be required to intervene, because that's always what happens when we are in trouble. So
just to clarify, you're setting out a scenario of disaster, or what exactly is the kind of scenario you're having in mind when saying that?
Well, I'm seeing a scenario, but not of hopefully not of disaster, because on one part of the economy and finance is already in that direction. So maybe we will not be very happy of that, and their voters also. But for sure of delay in and reduced form of ambition in comparison to what we had before and what could be achieved. Also, probably some negative feedback from the decisions that are going to be taken in terms of priorities for competitiveness, which could then negatively affect or increase our exposure to climate risk.
If I may, Nicolas, I think we should stress test the political feasibility of the regulation we have in Europe. Because again, if at some point you are going to face a political constraint, then your instruments are not credible. And there I fully agree with Irene. And I think there has been a number of political failures on that front, where sometimes in coalition governments, because even if you represent maybe 20% of the electorate, when you go around the table, you ask for something, and you trade policies with partners. In some countries, policies have been imposed that clearly a big majority of people were against. And then it's inevitable that at some point you hit a wall. We have surveys, and we've had surveys for the last 20 years, and we know that the majority of people are not willing to pay for the transition. They say it's important, but when you really ask them what they are willing to pay, except for a minority, maybe 20% of the population, it's not much. So if you don't address that question, and you put in place policies like forbidding gas boilers in Germany with the Greens, or you impose extremely ambitious insulation levels, where even sometimes it's not feasible, and you don't have the people to do it, you have a backlash, and we know it. So if you don't get your hands dirty, if you don't look at the cost of some technologies, if you don't stress test some of the policies from a political point of view, yes, the signals will be of a poor quality. And I think that's where we need to make progress. And it's not only bad news. I mean, I think with the huge investment that are now being made in the automotive sector, the price of batteries is going to come down. The price of EVs is going to come down. That means for households, I'm pretty optimistic that we have relatively cheap solution 15 years from now on all fronts. Now we have it on renewables, including storage, EVs, and a combination of insulation and heat pumps. So I'm not that pessimistic on that front, but we need to get our hands dirty and really look at what is feasible and efficient. Because if we lose the efficiency part of it and impose technologies that are way too expensive, it's just not going to work. And it's not a political statement here that I'm making. It's not a reflection of my own preferences. It's just not going to work.
So I'd like to pivot to a slightly different issue, which is more into the weeds of financial regulation, which is banking supervision. Pierre, you, as the governor of the National Bank of Belgium, you're also a banking supervisor. We had a session in this series with Martin Lubering on kind of interaction between climate finance and banking supervision, and the picture was that the Eurozone with a single supervisory mechanism was very much at the vanguard, if you can put it that way, of integrating climate considerations into supervision. Do you think that's a balanced approach, or is European banking supervision doing too much prioritization of green risk or climate-related risk compared to other risks? How do you look at that as a practitioner of supervision?
I'm not really a practitioner, because honestly, as governors, we're not really taking the decisions, and formally, yes, but still, I mean, we discuss those issues. I think we're in a learning process. I mean, honestly, it's a no-brainer that we would look at the risks, and we're still learning. The problem is basically that the past is not providing us with a lot of information. And then if you don't have data, you can run models, but it's, and so I have a lot of bankers that when I talk to them, they're lost because they are requested to describe risk that we don't know much about. And really, I would stop making stress tests with a static balance sheet for 25 years. I think it's completely, meaningless. But I would really focus on project finance and long-term, say, mortgages and so on, because there we have data, or at least, I mean, I fully understand that a bank would be required to ask its customers, what's your plan? You're investing for 25 years. You're still going to emit carbon 25 years from now. What's the plan? But when you're providing credit lines to SMEs and to firms for 1 year, I don't think we should look at climate risks on that front. We'll just learn, but we will learn with time, and we will see whether the risks are growing. We need to distinguish between insurance and physical risk and banking. And also, I think there is a bias, because people that work on these green risks are not, the typical medium voter. They do care a lot about greens, and most of the time they want to show that the risks are big. And then you have like the bankers don't get it kinds of narratives. I mean, we had that internally at our central bank, and we were proposed by our people working on that to basically stop investing in the industrial port of activities of the port of Antwerp, stop investing in Lufthansa. I take Lufthansa every 6 weeks to go to Frankfurt because I try the train, it doesn't work. So what is really the message that you want to give there? And they were, when I told them I'm not going to do that, it would be completely hypocritical to take Lufthansa, but say, but I'm not investing in it. And they were like, but the National Bank of France, the Banque de France does it. And they were, like for them, it was the worst day of their life because they wanted to convince us, the board, that we would stop investing in some of these activities. And, we are still in a world where there are some regulations. And I believe that a firm that complies with regulations in Europe, that is committed to go to net zero, we should not, as a central bank, impose things that are not imposed by others.
I noted the poke to Deutsche Bahn, sorry, the German railways. I experienced that too, so I have some sympathy with the argument. Even so, I still try to take the train between Brussels and Florence.
Try 3 times, and then I.
No, I know. It is an issue. Irene, you're doing climate stress tests for a living or as a consulting activity. I'm sure you have
mostly for research. Mostly for research. Yeah. So basically, I even sharing the concern about Deutsche Bahn, because I also have the same, we are all in the same, but this is a very interesting example, what you said, Pierre, that show us that we cannot go with one solution only. So divesting is not, doesn't work alone, also because then there is someone else who buys, and then ends up in the market that we don't really regulate. The point is trying to have a coordinated action between investments in the transition, which should also for trains, and this is possible. Look at Italy. Trains work quite, except some defiance, sometimes they mostly work well. So we need to have investments, which are long-term investments in technologies and infrastructures that support the transition and will support the phasing out from other activities that actually are piling up, contributing to climate risk. This should come from a fiscal side, and here we have the discussion, okay, how do we finance it? And this is a question also for the next EU budget, for instance, in Europe. But on the other hand, we should also consider regulation that fosters investors' disclosure, and in particular adequate disclosure and risk assessment. And with adequate, we mean adjusting the risk profile of activities. It's true, we don't have much data from the past, and also, by the way, future climate risk, we don't have the ball, we are not magicians, but we can know, we already know something about what could happen in the future, and these are the scenarios. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and more recently the Network for the Financial System, have developed scenarios which are based on scientific models about what could happen in the future if we introduce a carbon tax next year, in 10 years, if we never do it, and so on, and if you do it in Europe or or in an uncoordinated way. So we have scenarios, and what's the good news for us is that when we do stress tests, we work with scenarios. So it's really important to try to get to have both sides of the story. On the one hand, going on with financing infrastructures and developments for the transition and for building resilience to climate risk, because there is a huge insurance protection gap, probably not in Belgium, but in all the other countries there is. And on the other hand, create a regulatory framework that actually fosters adequate climate risk assessment, which is forward-looking. So they need to go hand in hand, and this is crucial to anchor expectations.
But conceptually agree with you. It's but it's the way we do it. I mean,
Exactly.
let's assume I'm a transportation company. I have trucks, and the literature tells me that probably around 2040, we can hope that electric trucks will be competitive. What is my climate plan? I don't control the technology. So I can put in my plan, I will buy carbon trucks when it will be electric trucks, when it will be mandated or cheaper. And I put that in my plan. But I don't control technology. I'm a bank. I'm providing a loan to that company. What's the risk of that company going bankrupt? Well, if tomorrow suddenly there is a regulation that kills half the sector, there is a big risk. If they are still allowed to run with combustion engine trucks, and I'm providing it with a loan for 2 years, liquidity line, my risk is extremely limited. And I'm a bit concerned that we are trying to capture all these very difficult issues with some scenarios and stress tests that honestly, I think at some point are just stories that we tell ourselves. Now, if it's just for illustrative purposes and you try to, but if we use that, then that to sort of put add-ons to capital position of banks and so on, I don't think the quality is there, honestly.
Irene, let me frame that a little bit differently. We mentioned the Eurozone, the European Parliament elections, the fact that the system is crying for a slightly different balance than what was introduced in the last 5 years with a lot of regulatory initiatives. Is there anything in the current framework where you see scope for streamlining and simplification on the basis of lessons learned in the recent years? Or do you think that essentially, given the imperative of fighting climate change, we can only go in the direction of adding more compliance requirements? I know this sounds a little bit populistic, the way I'm framing the question, but I would be very interested in your view.
No, you are...
Sorry, Irene, sorry.
Irene.
I perfectly agree with you. I mean, I really hope we don't go in the direction of Basel III. I mean, we have like another war and peace for climate, war and peace size of regulation for climate. But as I mentioned, when we started the discussion, I really hope we don't go for more regulation, but for better regulation. Now we have a lot of scientific ground.
What should we streamline? Can you give examples of where the lessons of the last few years would give us scope for better regulation, concretely?
For instance, what is green and what is not green? This is fundamental. When you go to the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Directive, it's still unclear when you go, for instance, at Article 8 or Article 9, who is responsible for disclosing what is green and what is not green, and who bears the risk then if, for instance, you are an investment fund, you invest in a company, it discloses, or in a financial institution, it discloses badly, and then who's the risk? So there is, we need something much simpler and some criteria to identify what is a sustainable investment, so that and getting back to the original idea of the taxonomy and simplifying it, instead than trying to add on in order to get well along with everybody.
Sorry to push you on this, but is that actually possible? You mentioned that the taxonomy should be science-based, but is it possible to simplify it and make it more based on principles, given the complexity of what we're actually talking about?
It was originally it was based on, and it's still based on some few principles. I mean, there are principles: climate mitigation, adaptation, do not do harm, which are then measured both with emissions but also with technology profiles. So, getting back to there, the point is what passes between how we identify activities. So these are mapped at the level of sector of economic activity, very granular, and also into financial activities. So we already have a mapping done by scientists. And then what happens when it goes into the regulation? Because the regulation is kept probably voluntarily a bit unclear. So that's the point. So we need less regulation, but much more clear. And at the same time, however, since we live in a world of trade-off, and we know that is costly to implement regulation, in particular when other parts of the world are withdrawing from going green, We need to support the economy, and we need to support it in a stable way, no matter what are the political elections, and to do it with financial instruments which are sustainable themselves for all countries.
We're almost at the hour. I have a last question, which was raised early in the session by Georges Hugeux, which is about what we can learn from insurers and reinsurers. Georges is mentioning that they have started refusing to issue to insure some risks or increase the cost of climate risk coverage. Can this approach be integrated in the regulatory framework? Pierre, this one is for you.
Honestly, I don't know, but I would really want to come back 1 second to the taxonomy. I mean, are solar panels from China green if they've been produced with electricity that is brown to some extent? It's never going to be easy. And, you know, it's 1,000-page long, and it's going to be 2,000 pages before we've answered all those questions. My understanding is that windmills with steel that is not completely green are green. I mean, it's without end, I believe. I'm afraid it's without end, and then we have to decide what we do with the taxonomy. So I'm not optimistic on that front, to be frank with you.
Irene, very briefly, we're already past the hour, but you have the last word.
If we already can say that solar PV from China come from coal-based electricity, then we already have a quite good understanding of the situation. So we don't have much complexity for the basic things. For insurance, I mean, we are running a project with the European Commission and 14 national authorities. There is a major insurance protection gap, yet it is very heterogeneous across EU member states. I mean, it's Euro-based. And that's an issue because, of course, if one country has major losses, then from acute physical risk, so from natural disasters, then it's an issue even in the short term for the bank who lend, in particular to small and medium enterprises, which are affected. So here we come back to the risk. We need to think insurance.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I have to bring that to the end because we have this discipline of finishing more or less at the hour, but I think this illustrates something which is a good thing, that which we have much more to discuss on this, and we'll come back to that theme in future sessions of this series. The next session will be about Basel III and the way different jurisdictions comply more or less or not at all with it. We'll have that with Dan Davis, who is a very expert analyst of bank capital, and Pierre Wunsch, who has a lot of experience of Basel-related policymaking in the EU. That will be on October 31st at the end of this month. Thank you so much again to both Irene Monasterolo and Pierre Wunsch for a fascinating discussion. We didn't come to a consensus on all issues, but that was a feature, not a bug. There is much more to be discussed on this. And again, I'm very grateful to both of you for engaging in that debate. Everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.